So I'd like to welcome you all to a very special event indeed. It's actually the first and inaugural webinar of the Trade Policy Exchange. And of course, it's titled Making Trade Policy Work for Gender Equality. So thank you for attending, and we're very pleased to be able to share this event with you. My name is Khulufelo Kugler, and I'm the co-founder of the Trade Policy Exchange, which I co-founded with Stephanie Noel, and the other member of our steering committee, Nicholas Kola Suzuki, is also here. And so we really welcome you warmly. So just to give you a short little background on what Trade Policy Exchange is before we get started with our event, is basically it is a platform or initiative, which is actually an associated that we have incorporated or registered in Switzerland, that seeks to bring diversity and inclusion into trade and trade policy in every way imaginable. I mean, one way that you could see is obviously our panel today, and also just really bring the multi-stakeholder aspect of it. Every single event and every single initiative that we'll embark upon will very clearly reflect this multi-stakeholder aspect of it, and of course, the diversity and inclusion. And before we get started, just to give you some information of what we have in store for webinars for April, I'd like to announce that there will be a webinar on the 15th of April. It's 4:30, and it's called, Do We Need a WTO Climate Waiver? And so I very much encourage you to attend if you are interested in trade and environment issues. And again, on the 28th, we will discuss the state of play of the WTO e-commerce plurilateral. So now we'll start our event. So as you all know, trade has improved the living standards of everyone across the globe, especially those of women. According to the World Bank and the WTO, firms that engage in cross-border trade employ more women. Women are also better represented in firms that participate in global value chains and that are foreign-owned. Studies also show that women who engage in international trade generally have higher incomes. Now, notwithstanding the significant contributions that women have made to the global economy, women's economic opportunities are still unequal to those of their male counterparts. In recent years, addressing gender equality has occupied global agendas, and buzzwords such as gender mainstreaming, pink tariffs, and pink taxes have emerged. However, progress has been slow and erratic. And certainly, the COVID-19 pandemic has not helped because it has exacerbated the plight of women because of its disproportionate impacts on women-dominated economic sectors. Now, the rationale for this webinar is quite clear. Trade and gender issues are not seasonal, nor are they trendy, so they must be addressed in a comprehensive and systemic manner because they directly and indirectly affect all of us. So it is indeed my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel who will navigate through some of these issues with us today. And I will introduce them in the order of their intervention. Our first panelist is Dr. Amrita Bari, who is an assistant professor of international trade law at ITAM and co-chair professor for the WTO Chair Program in Mexico. Amrita is the founding chair of International Trade Investment Law Research Group and a founding member of the South Asian International Economic Law Network, the SAIELN. She has a PhD in International Trade Law from University of Birmingham and an LLM from International Business Law from the London School of Economics. Amrita is also well published, and one of her publications includes a monograph called Public and Private Partnership for WTO Dispute Settlement, Enabling Developing Countries. And she's also designed the very first framework to measure gender responsiveness of free trade agreements. And this is explained in a policy paper titled Mainstreaming Gender in Free Trade Agreements. Our second panelist is Dr. Renata Vargas Amaral, who is an experienced trade lawyer with extensive and proven record of successful engagement at the World Trade Organization, bilateral and regional trade negotiations, domestic trade policy, and market access. Over the course of her career, she's advised governments and private stakeholders on international trade matters with a focus on WTO law. She currently serves as adjunct professor at the American University Washington College of Law, where she co-directs the certificate program on WTO and US trade law and policy. Among other achievements, she is the founder of Women Inside Trade, which is a nonprofit international organization that aims to contribute to the empowerment of women. She holds a PhD from Maastricht University in the Netherlands and the title of Doctor of Laws summa cum laude from the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil, among other qualifications. Ambassador Stephen de Boer was appointed as Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization on the 21st of August in 2017. Ambassador Boer joined the Global Affairs Canada in 2005. In 2006, he was named the director of the Softwood Lumber Division. From 2008 to 2010, he served as the director of the Oceans and Environmental Law Division. In 2010, he joined the Environment Canada as the Deputy Chief Negotiator for Climate Change and the Director General responsible for Canada's international climate change negotiations and partnership. Ambassador Boer holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws from Western University and a Master of Laws in International and Comparative Law from Georgetown University. Our next panelist is Ms. Phyllis Wanjiru Mwangi, who is the National Coordinator of ITC Trade's Commonwealth Project in Kenya. She is also an entrepreneur and an exporter. She owns an e-commerce company called sendflowers.co.ke. She also owns a consulting company called Edge Consulting Limited, where she has over 15 years track record of supporting women in business as a trainer and consultant in sales, marketing, and leadership, all designed to grow businesses from good to great. Phyllis holds a Bachelor in Business Management degree from Moy University and a higher national diploma from the Institute of Human Resource Management, among other qualifications. Finally, our final panelist is Ms. Tefa Ashre, who is a lawyer specializing in international trade law and governance. She has experience in international law and trade policy and has worked on trade and development, regional integration, and business competitiveness at the national, sub-regional, and international levels of governance. She has previously worked for the Economic Community of West African State, ECOWAS, and she also served at the WTO on negotiations and as a research associate in the Office of the Director General, Roberto Azevedo, before moving to the Development Division. She also worked in the government of Nigeria in the newly created Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiations, where she participated in negotiations and in-country consultations on the African Continental Free Trade Area. She currently leads the ITC's in-country implementation of the She Trades Commonwealth project by developing and delivering business support and capacity building on international trade and competitiveness to small, medium-sized enterprises and relevant stakeholders. She holds a bachelor's degree in law and had joined the Nigerian Bar in 2010. She also has a postgraduate master's degree in economic law from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. It is really a pleasure to welcome all of you. And without any further ado, I would like us to start our event. And before we start, I just want to explain the format of this event. It's a roundtable. And so we will have our panelists make 3-minute interventions. And thereafter, we'll have a discussion for 10 minutes. And therefore, thereafter, we'll have a second 3-minute intervention round. Thereafter, we'll have another 10 minutes of discussion. And then thereafter, we will have a Q&A session. Now, I encourage you, please, our audience, to include and to write your question in the Q&A box, and we will address those questions whether as they come or during the Q&A session, which we have reserved the last 30 minutes of this event. So without any further ado, Amrita, please could you take the floor?
Thank you. So let me talk about gender mainstreaming in trade agreements, the buzzword that Colafalo kindly mentioned a while ago. And I would like to start my intervention with the comment from New Zealand's Minister of Trade and Environment, David Parker. He said, it's not fair to rely on trade to cure all of the world's environmental problems. But it is fair to ask if trade agreements can help. Multiple studies have already shown that trade agreements, if negotiated with a gender lens, can help. They can translate into more job opportunities, better business connections, enhanced market access, fewer barriers to access finances and other productive resources for women. And the list goes on. One way to negotiate trade agreements with a gender lens is by mainstreaming gender considerations. So let me share my thoughts on three things. First, what is gender mainstreaming? Second, how existing trade agreements have employed this approach. And third, what has been the triggers behind this change? So gender mainstreaming in this context means the inclusion of gender equality concerns in the drafting and implementation of trade agreements. The last 5 years have been phenomenal in this respect. We have seen an impressive increase in the number of FTAs mainstreaming gender considerations in these few years. As we speak today, more than 23% of existing agreements include at least one gender explicit commitment in its text. Even though, and I think it is important to mention that most of these commitments are drafted as best endeavor promises and not as binding obligations. 6 countries have signed agreements with a standalone chapter on trade and gender. In 2016, Chile and Uruguay signed the very first trade agreement with a standalone chapter on trade and gender, followed by Chile and Argentina and Chile and Brazil in 2017 and 18. 2018, we had European Parliament pass a resolution to include gender equality consideration in all its trade agreements. In the same year, EU and Canada adopted CETA trade and gender recommendations, which I'm sure Ambassador Boy would talk about in a while. In 2019, 2 modernized FTAs, Canada-Israel and Canada-Chile, came into force. Parties in these agreements make several advanced commitments to work on women empowerment through networks, education, and skill development. Moreover, there are several other agreements that talk about various other things, including access to finance, health services, education, childcare, violence, and discrimination. And that brings me to my last point. What are the triggers of these developments? What caused this development to be pushed to this extent in these last few years? One of the triggers is the emergence of countries that have started to champion this change. The countries leading this change have incentivized other countries, perhaps with their market access benefits, to negotiate gender-responsive trade agreements. And the other important trigger in this respect is the massive advancement in studies and in research that have clarified the understanding on trade and gender nexus. One particular study that I would like to mention is the ITC's Gender Mainstreaming Toolkit. This toolkit can guide trade negotiators on how they can negotiate and draft gender-responsive agreements. Last year, working with ITC, International Trade Center, we designed this first ever toolkit that can help negotiators measure the gender responsiveness of their trade agreements. So I would like to invite our policy audience to give this toolkit a try. And I'll see if there are any questions about it.
Thank you very much, Amrita. So Renata, you can just jump in.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
Carl.
just sorry, let me just also just subsequently after, so we can just keep the ball rolling, if Ambassador and then Phyllis and then Tefa.
Perfect. So I would like to start by just saying this. As we all know, but maybe it's not very clear all the time, the future of the international economic order is contingent on the ability of governments and also the private sector to distribute the benefits of economic growth equally to all. So until now, that has not been the case, and we are in 2021. So as we just heard from Rita that explained it and highlighted this very well, over the past years, there was an upsurge has been observed in trade agreements that carve out space for gender issues in their agendas. The same is not true for international investment treaties. And we have to be aware that foreign direct investment inflows can lead to more opportunities for women in the job market, but may also exacerbate disparities. So today I would like to briefly address and compare the role and effect of gender provisions in trade and investment agreements, and to shed light on additional policies that might be needed to ensure that governments and multinational enterprises address gender constraints. Although it would be natural to believe that a rise of trade and investment in the economy would lead to more opportunities for women, studies consistently show that trade and investment policies are not gender neutral. That means that although the current trade and investment paradigms are supposed to increase growth, decrease inequalities, and promote employment, evidence shows, especially in developing countries, I'm from Brazil, that a more globalized economy and a boost of foreign direct investment by multinational enterprises might increase inequalities, especially across sector, income, gender, and social groups. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the private sector role in my second intervention. So now I would like just to highlight a little bit that what happens with investment agreements. That unlike trade agreements, very few bilateral investment treaties currently include gender provisions. Out of almost 80 model agreements published online by UNCTAD's Investment Policy Hub, only 6 actually explicitly address gender, albeit through broad provisions that refer to fair and equitable trade between men and women, for example. All of the agreements that mention gender were adopted in the last 6 years, showing a positive trend in this regard, but nevertheless, others from the same time period did not include such protections, which shows that there is still room for growth. A few other agreements just make reference to international agreements, such as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, suggesting that companies abide by certain standards of responsible business by implementing policies that address various issues, including trade. Among the few examples of countries that have submitted model bilateral investment treaties containing gender provisions is the Netherlands. And I'm going to finalize here, just give an example of the Netherlands, because it is one of the most recent version of government's model BIT that was recently published by UNCTAD last year. And amid the interesting changes introduced, this model includes a commitment to promote equal opportunities and participation for women and men in the economy. The preamble recognizes the importance of gender equality in international trade and investment policies, and Article 6, paragraph 3 of the Netherlands model states the following, and I'm going to conclude here. The contracting parties emphasize the important contribution by women to economic growth through their participation in economic activity, including in international investment. They acknowledge the importance of incorporating a gender perspective into the promotion of inclusive economic growth. This includes removing barriers to women's participation in the economy and the key role that gender-responsive policies play in achieving sustainable development. I'm going to stop here, and then, Ambassador, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in today's panel. I really welcome the opportunity to speak about the importance that Canada attaches to advancing gender equality internationally. And this is part of an overall priority for the Government of Canada. It's shared by all government departments and agencies, and every facet of government has a role or contribution to make, including trade policy. As part of our trade diversification strategy, Canada is advancing an inclusive approach to trade that seeks to ensure the benefits of trade are more widely shared, including with underrepresented groups such as women, SMEs, and Indigenous peoples. And we have sought trade and gender chapters in trade negotiations with willing parties. And these chapters recognize the importance of mutually supportive trade and gender policies, incorporating a gender perspective into trade, and removing barriers to participation that women face. In recognizing the importance of implementing international instruments that advance gender equality and women's economic empowerment, such as the CEDAW and the Buenos Aires Declaration, and to establish a framework to undertake cooperation activities on issues related to trade and women's economic empowerment and facilitate information exchange to advance the parties' collective understanding around the issues and establish a dedicated bilateral committee to oversee the activities, review implementation of the chapter. And to date, Canada has 2 trade and gender chapters in force with Chile and Israel, a trade and gender recommendation with the EU, and is part of the global trade and gender arrangement with Chile and New Zealand. We are seeking trade and gender chapters in ongoing FTA negotiations as well, such as Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance. In support of our objectives to remove barriers to trade by mainstreaming inclusive trade and gender responsive provisions across our FTAs, we've also begun conducting gender-based analysis of our FTAs. For example, Canada has been conducting a comprehensive chapter-by-chapter GBA plus of the ongoing FTA negotiations with Mercosur, considering the effects on Canadian men and women across the economy in their role as workers, business owners, and consumers. The findings of the GBA Plus analysis has led to the development of several new and innovative, inclusive, and gender-responsive provisions across the full FTA to enhance opportunities and mitigate the risk of unintended consequences. For example, we seek to ensure at least one woman is appointed to dispute settlement panels in the dispute settlement chapter. In the services chapter, we seek to ensure non-discrimination on the basis of gender in the certification of professional services. And in the e-commerce chapter, we seek privacy protections that will be important for the LGBTQ people. The GBA Plus has informed negotiations and has provided negotiators with a rich sense of the effects of the FTA on Canadians in all their diversity across the country. This is now a standard approach for Canada, which we will be applying in future negotiations. GBA Plus can also be done on an ex post facto basis, as we did with CUSMA. From a Geneva perspective, our objective is to share our experiences and lessons learned from our bilateral negotiating experience with our WTO partners, and to look at how they can be applied in the WTO context. We're already quite engaged in gender issues at the WTO, including in the informal working group on trade and gender, as well as the discussions on domestic regulation as services, where we have tabled a proposal on eliminating gender discrimination for professional services, certification, and licensing. I'm also very proud of the work that Canada did in supporting the drafting and adoption of the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Gender and its implementation. Indeed, we were the first country to organize a workshop on GBA Plus under the Buenos Aires Declaration at the WTO. As we move towards MC12, Canada is working to strengthen trade and gender across the WTO and further build on the Buenos Aires Declaration through the informal working group. Canada drafted a 2021 work plan for the working group, which has been endorsed by the members. The work plan is built on 4 pillars: aid for trade, gender lens, research and data, and best practices workshops. And the key guiding principles, including participation in multilateral organizations such as the OECD, ECLAC, UNCTAD, ITC, and World Bank. Our goal is to deliver an outcome for MC12, laying out what can be achieved this year, as well as clearly articulating what our plans and objectives going forward will be. There's a lot of work to do, and we're looking forward to working with our partners to make real progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Phyllis, you can go ahead with your intervention.
Right. Thank you very much, Kolo, and thank you, team. It's really a pleasure to be here as with the lens of a woman-owned business. So apart from being the national coordinator of the She Trades in the Commonwealth project in Kenya, I'm glad to really contribute in this discussion as an entrepreneur who is dealing in international trade. And so as early as 2005, I started exporting handicrafts to the US market through a trade portal known as handygallery.com. And my dream was to bring Maasai market, you know, those little trinkets that tourists really love, to the international markets without them having to travel. And I must say that was 2005, 2006, really pushed to have this business, to get this business succeed, and also planning to take advantage, was really trying to align it to the AGOA initiative. But as you know, SMEs, the business model was wanting, but one of the major things that was wanting, and I'm starting now to speak into the points on what we could do in trade and policy, is of course the quality, the consistency of the quality of the products we were exporting, and also the ability to scale. It was very difficult. And above all, even when we fixed all those, then we did not have the capital, which means access to finance was difficult for us. Now, after 2020, of course, it's been a steep learning curve. Today, we are running online stores to provide services and products to local and international markets. Some of the stores, most of the stores we have are business to consumer model, which means we really are retailing one by one. But that's where we began, and that's you know, where most of our successes have been. But just in 2019, before 2020, we had a grand plan to launch our B2B, which was going to be the next big thing. But then, thanks to the pandemic, that is on hold. So looking at the ITC SME competitiveness survey done in Kenya in 2016, I learned that 82% of the women-owned businesses like me are playing in the MSME space. I mean, 82%, that is huge. And what does this mean? I'll borrow a statement from Dr. Kitui, formerly of UNCTAD, who said, word to word, he said, in quotes, when trucks cross our borders, it is called free trade area. When a woman at the border crosses with a small bag of goods, it's called smuggling. This sentence really spoke to me because it almost, you know, culminated into my entire experience in doing business because it's been an interesting path. So I would like to hedge my observations on this particular point. I want you to extrapolate this statement into international markets, extrapolate it into international borders. Then we can begin to see the amount of work that women-owned businesses, you know, that really needs to go into women-owned businesses to bring them to a level playing field in trade. And so that they can be able to run sustainable businesses, especially post-pandemic. And I just want to appreciate that I feel today like you know, what a privilege to sit with the people who are actually creating these currents, these waves that are meant to lift my businesses to the next level. So that's really appreciated. So I want to make 2 points before I close in my first intervention, that of course, as a woman-owned business, I understand, just like governments, that policies really speak into the macro environment. Sometimes the truth is the policy does look very good in paper, but the execution does not factor in most of the times the SMEs. And remember, this is where most of the women-owned businesses are playing. It would be great if trade policies can come with perhaps micro riders, certain pillars, defined pillars that then can help create that current that you're looking for to move us swiftly towards the realization of that trade policy. The next thing I want to say, and I think someone alluded to it, I think it's the ambassador from Canada who's saying that you have managed to get disaggregated data. This is the next big piece. I'm representing, you know, I guess Africa. I'm speaking as a woman doing business in Kenya. But for us, the disaggregated data is not there in terms of, is not very clear. And if it's there, then I don't know where, we don't know where to find it. I don't know where to find it. So, well, of course, there's no country that overtly imposes tariffs according to gender. The implicit biases are real. We felt them throughout the years, and this really put us women in business, in international trade, at an economic disadvantage. So I think we would want to borrow a leaf from what Canada is doing to really look at disaggregated data and begin to take that data. And of course, there's the She Trades Outlook, which Dr. Amrita talked about in the beginning, which we are hoping can kick into the African nations, even as we prepare for Africa Free Trade Agreement. The third thing, of course, is the underlying thing, trade policy. will not happen, it will not be realized without education. And I think education, when I talk about education, it's girl, it's women, it's lots of capacity building. And in capacity building, I want to emphasize not just training sessions, but also mentoring, coaching, and hand-holding those women-owned businesses so that they can really grow. From good to great. So in my next intervention, I'll talk about, so that's the future, we've come along, that's the past, we've come a long way. I'm going to talk about then the future post-pandemic world. What are the opportunities? What are the areas that, if catalyzed, can really level the playing field for women in business? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. I feel like if everybody has said so much already, I don't know what to add and what to take away. Hopefully I won't be taking anything away, but thank you so much, Kulo, and of course the Trade Policy Exchange for giving me the opportunity to contribute and to be part of this discussion. It's one that I think is very important, and I'm glad that I'm able to, I think the lingua franca is 2 cents, but because I'm Nigerian, I'll say I'm glad I'm able to contribute my 2 kobo to the entire conversation. I think the last year has given us a unique opportunity. I'll really be talking about women, trade, and COVID, and the impact it had on them and what we can learn from the experience over the last 12 months. So I think the last year gave us all a unique opportunity to stop and rethink our strategy on women and trade. It's important before we start to move forward. I know there's been a lot of conversation about building back better, building green, coming back stronger. I think before we move forward, it's important for us to reflect on what we learned over the last 12 months. And it's important for us to, why are more women losing their jobs? Why are more women-owned SMEs closing or reporting higher losses? Why are more women-owned businesses becoming bankrupt? Why are more women, reporting abuse? So there are several things that we need to think about before going forward, so that we're able to, it's still, I think Samirita pointed out that it's been 5 years since we started to take active steps to introduce and to emphasize the strong linkage that trade has with women. So I think it's a path that hasn't been carved out before. So it's important for us to build and learn as we go forward. And the last year has given us, again, just to emphasize, a wonderful opportunity to understand the particular vulnerabilities that women face within the economy, and why is it that they're so open and exposed to economic shocks, to crisis, to shifts, to displacements. From what we're learning, we understand that over the next couple of years, crises and shocks such as COVID will continue to happen at an even more frequently than it has in the past. So in order to ensure that women continue to play, and if history repeats itself, the next time something like COVID happens, we will see more women losing their jobs. We'll see more women like a retraction in the efforts that we have made over the last 50 years to increase women's participation and contribution to the economy. So really, that's what I'll be talking about over the next couple of minutes. Just to also point out some of those challenges, or some of the causes, or some of the weaknesses or vulnerabilities that we noticed with regards to the digital economy. I think Phyllis, perfect example. She was just talking about how she was able to build her entire business model and access international markets as a result of e-commerce. We saw that over the last, I think that's me. But basically, in my next intervention, I'll kind of build on these topics: digital transformation, its acceleration, and what that means for women in trade. I'll also be speaking about labor mobility. Why is it that women are more prevalent in certain sectors, and why are those sectors more vulnerable to shocks? And how can we move them away from that into more, more resilient areas of our economy? And do we even know where they are playing in our economy right now? Which goes to the point on labor, and of course, the social and economic aspects of women-owned businesses, whether it's a woman informally trading or a woman that is running a business and actively participating and contributing to the economy. So I think I'll come back to some of those points over the next intervention, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your marvelous interventions, and there's just so much food for thought. And in our discussion, which will truncate a little bit so that we can at least get some of the gems that you want to talk about in the next session, I'd like to take liberty, Tefa, actually, to ask you to give us at least one example of those, women-specific challenges that you've learned and come across in the past year.
Do I have a time limit?
Well, maybe just one.
One example. Fortunately, my connection is not going to go off today, but that's one example. I have been running a project in Nigeria for the past 12 months, and because of the lockdown, all our activities had to go virtual. This meant that women-owned businesses that were receiving capacity building technical skills from us, either they had the digital skills to be able to connect, or they had access to internet, or they had a device, or they had access to electricity. Otherwise, they were not able to continue to benefit from the wonderful program and the wonderful activities and opportunities that we're providing. Over the last year, another example, but it all relates to the digital economy actually. Over the last year, we also saw that a lot of international trade fairs, which are these huge platforms where businesses are able to go and meet buyers, able to meet investors, they've also gone digital. If the digital gender gap continues to, as it is, it means that we'll be leaving behind a larger group of our population. Basically, we'll be leaving behind so many women so many women. So basically, those are just a few examples on the disproportionate effects that that COVID had on businesses. So access to the internet and basic things like this. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, the digital divide is great, and especially in Africa. I mean, I listened to some rounds of the John H. Jackson Moot Court, and some of the teams you couldn't even hear. And this was the African regional round. So I mean, the digital divide really can basically make or break businesses, like in your instance. Now, Amrita, I was very interested to hear about this toolkit that negotiators can use. And so, if I'm a negotiator and I'm trying to negotiate an agreement, an FTA, and I want to use, gender provisions, or, think about gender lens, mainstream gender, how do we use this toolkit then?
Great question. Thanks, Kolo. So this is a toolkit, first of all, to measure gender responsiveness of the agreement's text. It is not a toolkit to measure the impact. So it is, in that sense, different from frameworks like UNCTAD's toolkit on gender and trade and GBA+, for instance, right? Now, this toolkit is based on the maturity framework. And a trade negotiator has to answer a questionnaire. This questionnaire contains 20 questions. Each question has 3 corresponding answers, and each answer relates to a maturity level. There are 3 levels in total. Once all the 20 questions of this questionnaire are answered, the agreement gets a score. And that score corresponds to one of the 3 maturity levels. The first maturity level is limited. So if you have a score under 25%, then you will have limited level of gender responsiveness. If you have a score within certain range of percentage that is predetermined in the model, then you would be evolving in terms of your gender responsiveness. And the third and the most advanced level is the advanced level of gender responsiveness. So the first benefit a trade negotiator would have by using this toolkit would be to see where they are in terms of how gender responsive their trade agreements are, because we keep on talking about trade and gender nexus and the relationship between the two. But it is important to give the tools and the understanding and the metrics to our trade negotiators and policymakers to know as to how they can make their trade agreements, the text, gender responsive. So the first benefit is to help them track where their agreement is at the moment. And if the country has the political willingness and appetite to go further, the tool will tell them or give them recommendations on how they can take the next step in terms of going to the next level of gender responsiveness. This is what the tool is doing, and it can be used for new negotiations in terms of negotiating new trade agreements, and it can also be used for modernization and renegotiation of the existing agreements in this sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that this tool almost sounds like you have to have a text, you have to have negotiated something. So it feels like maybe it's inflexible in that, or maybe it comes too late in the process.
Right. So that's an excellent question. And the answer is, this tool can only be used once we have the preliminary draft.
Yeah.
For instance, once we have we had the Canada and the European Union draft. When we had that before it came into force, that was the time to apply the model to measure gender responsiveness of this trade agreement. And before it is finalized, it is signed, and it comes into force.
Okay.
That is the right stage. However, we have more than 400 agreements in force today. Does that mean that the tool is of no use for these existing trade agreements? The answer is no. I think these agreements can still be analyzed. They can still be judged by using this toolkit to see where they are in terms of gender responsiveness. So if and when the countries seek to renegotiate or modernize them in the future, they can incorporate these recommendations to go to the next level. And of course, this is context dependent. It is highly dependent on various domestic issues, the readiness of the country, because there's a huge cost of compliance when it comes to assuming commitments related to gender equality. And it also relies on the political willingness and the appetite of the country to sort of assume and take upon these responsibilities, even though in cooperative and best endeavor promises form.
Absolutely. I think this gives me a really good, it's a good time for me to pivot to the ambassador and to just ask, I've got two specific questions on your intervention. And you mentioned that, the provisions or Canada's FTAs are negotiated, or at least the whole approach is with a gender perspective. What does that mean in sort of tangibly? What type of factors are those gender perspectives that negotiators will go into the negotiating room with, or just in general of the whole policy that Canada has espoused?
Well, look, I think until very recently, is probably as late as 10 years ago, the assumption was that trade negotiations and the outcomes of trade negotiations were on their face neutral, and that there was no point in even asking the question. There was no difference between a man and a woman when we talked about impacts of a trade agreement. So we didn't even bother asking the question. And so what gender-based analysis is doing is it's starting to ask those questions. What is the impact of these provisions on women or on other, for GBA, of course, it is on the gender part of it, but we're asking other questions as well with respect to LGBTQI, with Indigenous peoples. We need to stop and ask the question. And what I like about the toolkit is, to your point, yes, it is ex post facto, but this is an iterative learning process. And so as you go through it and you realize which provisions are more sensitive, once you've measured it and then you've seen the impacts, then that informs you the next time around for the next agreement, or when you go to remodel and rejuvenate the agreement. And what we're sensing at the WTO in some parts of the membership is this notion that everything is neutral. It's not worth measuring because people are very convinced in their assumptions that there's no point in measuring this. The impact is exactly the same. And we've already heard from a number of speakers that have said, actually, women's economic activity isn't always in the same sectors. It's not impacted in the same way by the trade rules. And we know the World Bank tells us every 2 years, every country in the world, including Canada, has domestic policies that are discriminatory against women. So how can we possibly say, if you layer on top of that an international trade agreement, that is automatically going to be neutral when the very fundamentals of that economy have discriminatory measures built into it? So gender-based analysis is a really important way to say, okay, stop. Let's measure what's going on here. Let's not assume anything about this system, and let's not assume anything about these negotiations going forward, or as we're going through these negotiations. I think it's more valuable to be doing this during the negotiations, but that's not to say there isn't a value to do it after the negotiations are complete. We have to, I don't want to say we have to be patient. I don't want to be patient, but we do need to appreciate that it's an iterative process and we're learning as we're going. And I think that's a really fundamental part about gender-based analysis.
Okay. Ambassador, I'm just interested though, you know, with the two agreements that you said Canada has concluded with Chile and Israel, and there are gender provisions. Has there been any analysis of the impact of those provisions and how they are used as, you know, within international trade between the countries, so between Canada and Chile and Canada and Israel, and whether the GBA plus analysis sort of extends to that to measure the actual impact of the provisions?
So I'm actually not an expert as to what came out of the gender-based analysis, and I don't know if anybody here has seen any of that. I do know that it has informed our work going forward in areas, and I do know that it absolutely informs what we're saying about the MISMES negotiations at the WTO, and also with respect to e-commerce.
Okay. Renata, if I may, I just have a very obvious question. So we have, you know, FTAs, you know, 23% of them have a gender provision. And then we go to IIAs, which are international investment agreements. And you said out of the 80 model agreements, only 6 have, you know, 6 explicitly address gender. Why is there such a disparity between trade and investment?
That's a very good question, Cole. I think one of the answers I have for you that made sense for me when I was researching this is that for trade we have a system that it's more concentrated, right? We have multilateral, like the World Trade Organization. Everything is more concentrated, and I think once the FTA started to implement and to apply gender provisions into agreements, it was a natural process. The investment system is all spread. We don't have a concentrated system. So for me, that's the easy answer for you, and made sense for me because the system is all spread. You don't have a rule system like we have for the multilateral trading system. So I think that's the easy answer for you, and it makes sense for me. I hope it makes for you. And may I just make a mess here and ask something for the ambassador?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
So, Ambassador, I'm just curious, and I want to, since you are here among us, I would like to ask something that really, I always ask myself. I know the GBA plus, it was applied for the Mercosur Canada negotiations, but I always wonder to what extent the system, the GBA, has the ability to be implemented with very different levels of problems that women face in different countries. For example, we have here Nigeria, Kenya, Brazil, myself, Mexico with Anrita. And because it's very different, the levels of problems that women face in each of these countries, depending on the level of development of the countries. So in your opinion, I would like to, I don't know if there is an easy answer for this, but I'm always wondering to what extent it can raise awareness, or it can help these countries with the different levels of problems that women face, depending on the level of development.
So I am not an expert on gender-based analysis plus, but I would say this, it seems perfectly logical to me that when Canada applies this lens, there is a bias that's built into that lens. That we would be looking at this from a Canadian perspective, and it will make sense for Canada. I cannot imagine that our tool is sensitive enough to deal with issues for which we have very little comprehension. That does not make sense to me. But what I would say is actually talking to your trading partners, like in Mercosur, saying, this is what we're doing. is very helpful for raising awareness with our trading partners to say, well, maybe you should be doing something similar. Presumably Brazil or Argentina or Uruguay, when they're applying their lens, will be applying it in a way that is much more sensitive to their reality. But I'm going to just go out there and say this because I don't know for a fact, but I just find it impossible to believe that our lens is a universal lens that would apply equally and capture everything the way it should for women in different situations. I find that difficult to imagine. That would be quite the tool if it could, quite frankly.
Thank you.
I see, Amrita, you have a question?
If I may also steal the opportunity of asking another question to Mr. Ambassador. You did mention Canada-Israel as one of the trade agreements. We have, ITC carried out an analysis of the gender responsiveness of the agreement, and it is at the advanced maturity level in the model that I explained a while ago. So it is quite advanced, and it has some very promising and ambitious gender responsive provisions. My question to you is, this is the only agreement which has explicitly mentioned that the trade and gender chapter in the agreement will be subject to the agreement's dispute settlement mechanism. However, in the same subclause, the parties have clarified that they would have the power to consent to the authority, to the jurisdiction of the mechanism as and when a case comes up in the future. That, to my understanding, is a binding but a non-compulsory jurisdiction. And if there is a possible dispute between Canada and Israel in the future, let's say if Canada files, if wants to pursue this issue or enforce a commitment that you have included with Israel in this agreement, it would be in the hands of the Israel as to whether they consent to the initiation of a mechanism. So I wanted to understand Canada's reasoning behind including this binding yet a very non-compulsory dispute settlement mechanism in the agreement.
So when I accepted the invite to come here, I didn't realize it was going to turn into a roast of the Canadian ambassador, but I'm happy to take the questions. Look, on Canada-Israel, I wasn't there. I don't know the fundamental thinking, but I have a couple of observations, and they also bleed into the WTO as well. And that is in areas that are considered new in trade agreements, it's in order to get members to actually engage on those issues, there generally has been some derogation from dispute settlement. And 25 years ago, talking about labor and environment provisions in trade agreements was, well, it wasn't necessarily taboo, but it wasn't subject to the same types of dispute settlement provisions. And in fact, in the NAFTA context, it's not until USMA, and it's actually Nancy Pelosi who turned the labor and environmental provisions into binding provisions by making them applicable to dispute settlement, and that's in 2019. So that's really 2018 or 2019, I can't remember. So that's really quite remarkable. And so it goes to my iterative process idea. I'm not saying it's a great result, but I think that's one thing that's happening. And I have to say, and this is the WTO angle, I have to say one of the major constraints about talking about women's economic empowerment at the WTO is that people say to me, WTO is a rule-making body, and everything in the WTO is subject to dispute settlement. And you are mucking around with social policy, and you're going to start telling me what I can or cannot do with respect to women in my country. And our response has been, this is about growing the pie. This is about advancing your economies. And these are rules about advancing your economies. Yes, they happen to have a gender lens, and they happen to talk about women, but this is what this is about. And the fact that they're part of the rule-based regime is normal. That's what should be happening. If you look at Canada's suggestion, or for example, on domestic services regulation. It just says don't discriminate in the licensing of service providers. You can say that we're mucking around with social policy, but that's an incredibly weak argument. But all of this to say, you feel sometimes like you have to sneak up on people with respect to some of these provisions, because they say, well, this looks like a rule, and if it's a rule, it must be subject to dispute settlement, and I don't want this subject to dispute settlement. So there's a number of ways of dealing with that. One of them is to say this is just about the economy. The other one is to say, okay, well, we won't make it as binding, but hopefully in 5 years, we'll change that. Hopefully in 10 years, this will be normal. I can't speak to the specifics of that agreement, but I think this is what is going on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your very interactive discussion. I see that we're almost at 7 o'clock, but we have 2 questions in the Q&A box. So I just encourage the participants, if you have any questions, please do put them in the box. But as we only have 2, I'm going to take the liberty of being the moderator and sort of extend a little bit to this session, and then obviously we will deal with the questions if and when they come. I'm going to, though, turn to Phyllis for the last question in the discussion, and then we're going to go back into our interventions, which I will limit and time to 2 minutes each. So I'll be cracking the whip. So Phyllis, you mentioned something very interesting for me, and I just sort of hashed onto that, which is AGOA, right? Trading under preferences. And so I just want you to give me, or just, your experience of obviously, trading under preferences, and how that has in any way assisted or not assisted, your business, and also specifically women-owned businesses. Do you find the preferences extend to women-specific sectors like clothing, for example? And, just sort of, you mentioned this, the pink tariff. So yeah. Maybe if you can just, give us your experience of trading under preferences, and how's that worked out for either yourself or the businesses that you consult for.
Okay, so thank you. That's a really great, question. So as I said earlier, mine was an online portal hoping to pivot on the AGOA opportunity. So we were dealing with beadwork, we were dealing with handicrafts, and we were dealing with just, soapstone and wood. Okay, and all those are covered in the AGOA, and of course leather also. However, because of the size of business, we really didn't get a chance to really experience the benefits of the AGOA Act. Because as I said earlier, we started off as B2C, and still today we are running B2C online portals. 2006, you can imagine, it was trickling in very few dimes, not a dollar, dimes trickling in, but I could sense this is the future. But because of the numbers, then you see AGOA then begins to favor larger institutions, which is what we're talking about. Small SMEs, very difficult to take advantage of the opportunities, and SMEs that are especially focusing on B2C. It might be better now, all right? But in 2006, it was very difficult to really get the benefit that AGOA was presenting. That said, we did survive for about 2 to 3 years, and eventually got larger contracts. But what I realized is the larger contracts out of some networks that I had moved more into private sector. And so we began to supply, Nike Foundation, we supplied, some different organizations with some of our products. But then by then we had already, we weren't really looking at, fixing in the AGOA benefit. So we really didn't play in that part. Now, what I see with the AGOA is if you are a large player, you will definitely get some, some good effect coming back to you. The EPZ, which is the export processing zone, is big on AGOA, and that's where you really begin to feel the benefits, which brings us back to that point that honestly, as we create these trade policies, is there any way we can put a lens into the SME and even more specifically the women who are, as I said earlier, 82% playing in the MSME space? So that would be my response.
Thank you. That's a really good response. And as we were talking, I was just really sort of surprised, and I just thought back to Renata's answer and my question as to, investment and trade agreements and the differences. And whereas, clearly, the investors would invest in Kenya or, for example, Lesotho or, the Caribbean because of the preferences, maybe that doesn't need to be put in an agreement. You know what I mean? I don't know if that's sort of a requirement or sort of a consideration that investors think about. But I always think about, there's a lot of investment going into different countries because they're able to get goods into big markets for very little, duties and tariffs and sort of barriers. Anyway, so we're going to move on to the second part of our intervention, which I would really invite you to limit to 2 minutes to continue the discussion. So I'm going to change the order a little bit so that we don't, get stuck in our old ways. And I will start sort of in reverse order if you don't mind. So Tefa, I'll start with you and then go to Phyllis and then the ambassador, then Renata, and then Amrita. So you're on the clock.
Coincidentally, I just wanted to also build on, or maybe just throw a little more light on what Phyllis had talked about, AGOA and small and medium-sized businesses, especially these micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, taking advantage of these preferential agreements that exist. And one thing is the knowledge gap between the existence of the preferences within these policy agreements and, these businesses actually knowing about it, understanding how to navigate it, understanding how to leverage on the opportunities that that are provided within the agreement, which kind of relates to what I was going to say during my second intervention about making the entire trade policy framing process more inclusive and ensuring that small and medium-sized enterprises who may not be able to, lobby for involvement or have a voice on their own because of their size, are able to find representation within their associations and their groups. So I think the question is how involved are women associations? How involved are the business support organizations that are representing the interests of women businesses specifically? How involved are they in international agreements, in regional treaty and trade agreements, in policy making, even at the national level? I know the national level might be a little more easy because it's right there, but I can imagine that up and coming women association in Nigeria might be hard for them to get access to the WTO based in Geneva, which then creates the entire opportunity, now that we have, online platforms but I think it's a unique opportunity for us to open up this debate, open up this conversation. The ambassador has talking a lot about irritative thinking and learning and how this entire process is about building on the knowledge that we already have and trying to improve on that. And I think it's important, very important actually, that women have a say in that learning process. And I think it'll be interesting to see how, for instance, if the informal group at the WTO, is there space to have civil society organizations and civil society organizations that are focused on gender issues, that are focused on women associations? Is it possible for them to be part of that conversation, not just in a way in which they are delivering maybe briefing notes or position papers, but they actually get feedback on what is being discussed, how does it affect them, and how can they benefit from these conversations, and even go deeper into influencing policy at the government level, because they may not be as exposed to the learnings and the lessons from Canada because they're so far away. But I think if we start to draw them into the entire process of making policy and laws and these agreements, then maybe they could start to benefit even more from the agreements. But as of now, because of that gap, that knowledge gap, it will be very difficult for us to make policy that actually impacts on small and medium-sized enterprises if they're not aware of what the benefits are. And I think that's what I'll say, talking about opening up.
Thank you very much. Phyllis?
Yes, I couldn't agree more with what Tafa has said, because trust me, in 2006, one of the things that attracted me to do this business was the existence of the AGOA, the AGOA FT. And, but then when you finally get in, it was difficult to get the information on our end as a business. And so I totally agree with Tefa that just making this information available, involving the women-owned businesses in drafting these free trade agreements, that will be very, very useful. So in my 2 minutes, I hope I still have 2 minutes, post-pandemic, and I just keep saying this statement. I feel as a woman in business, the lights went out in 2020, and then they're slowly coming on in 2021. And business, you know, as it was before 2020 is not the way it can continue in 2021. Before 2020 is not the way it can continue in 2021. And I think the bridge that is going to really help us move into the next, you know, big thing is technology. I think that's a no-brainer. It's technology. And a lot has been done before even 2020 to encourage women and girls. I think Tefa was asking the question, why are more women-owned businesses the ones really feeling the impact of this? Why are they the ones dying from the impact of, you know, the businesses just fizzling away from the impact of COVID? And to me, this is it. It's that women play in sectors that are not, let me say not resilient, because any sector can be made to be resilient, but just, you know, basic businesses, buy and sell, grow and sell, without really infusing technology into their practice. So yes, a lot has been done. I think STEM education is really on the increase, and STEM, I mean science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Of course, it's beginning to pay off because it started off with the young ladies. However, we still have far to go, and especially for the women-owned businesses who are currently existing. Digital entrepreneurship is definitely the way to go. But if we ask ourselves, how many women are playing in this space? Of course, you know, how many women can access computers, phones, access internet? Tefa did allude to that earlier on, and truly take advantage of, leave alone regional, just national, through either e-commerce or through exchange, running local, some of the local e-commerce stores, or regional, and then eventually international. I would say very few, okay? So it will be great if somehow, whether government or, you know, I think I would put it more on government, to find a way to incentivize and promote, especially, I think the big missing piece here would be private sector, to do business with MSMEs. And there's something we run called supplier diversity. That would be a great opportunity for us to begin to position, you know, trade agreements and encourage and activate the exchange between private sector, because this private sector, some of them are local, but others are international. And if MSMEs and SMEs can begin then to supply to this, that would be great. And my last point is, I would emphasize the need for aggregators. Of course, in agribusiness, it would be cooperatives. In technology, it would be hubs. There's online aggregators in textile, apparel, and handicrafts. I think I must just leave by saying aggregators really need to come up. And if we can find a way then to, in every industry, create systems and processes that support aggregators to really play a clean role in helping SMEs to become, you know, more resilient, then the SMEs can begin to really focus on what it is that they're really good at. And especially, you know, women SMEs then can begin to access markets in this way. So aggregators for me is critical. They take different forms and shapes, but that is, I think, another way to really activate regional and international business.
Ambassador, thank you very much for this.
So I'll do this under 2 minutes, and it's going to be all over the place because I'm reacting to some of the things that I've heard. But to Tifa's point, I really think, and this, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but asking the questions and talking to people, the need to consult. A really good example of blind spots that we have are, in Canada, agriculture tends to be dominated by men. And so we don't think about agriculture in the context of women's economic empowerment. But yet in a lot of developing countries, agriculture is dominated by women. And so we're not asking the right questions because we have a blind spot. We should be asking people, what are the issues that you are facing in your economy before we start developing policy? So this need to consult across the board with the private sector, with women with SMEs and find out what exactly are the barriers, because my assumptions about barriers or what I know about the Canadian economy doesn't always apply. In fact, in many cases it won't apply. And so that seems to be an incredibly important part of this conversation. The other thing I would say is this is the one thing that we know from our own experience in Canada that I'm quite sure applies across the board, but I haven't asked the question, and that is the notion of mentorship. That actually having role models and having people that you can talk to and women that you can talk to about how to do some of these things is extremely important. The other thing I would say is I think symbols matter, and they're not always just symbols, but it is important to put women in power, to start asking these questions and reminding us to be doing these things. So having Dr. Ngozi is very important. She has a commitment to change the makeup of the Secretariat, which for Canada is incredibly important. We need more women at the WTO because that's how we're going to move the ball forward as well. And then my final point is, and I'm repeating myself from before, but I think it bears repeating, we're not there yet at the WTO. We haven't actually created the dialogue that says this needs to happen. And this needs to happen because it's a sustainable development goal. This needs to happen because it's going to make us richer. And this needs to happen because this is the perfect place to be talking about economic issues. It's the WTO. They don't talk to me anymore about this shouldn't be talked about here. This is the place for it to be talked about. But this is 2021, and we're not done with that conversation yet. We haven't convinced everyone yet, but we need to. But I'm really, the JSIs on e-commerce, on MISMEs, these are really, really good spots to be elaborating on some of these issues. But man, there's a lot of work to be done yet. Thank you.
Indeed. Renata?
Thank you, Ambassador. And I have to say, you are doing an amazing job as the only man in our panel, so thank you. So I'd like to just make brief comments on the private sector role, but not talking about the talking actually more about the multinational enterprise's role in all this. So in the international investment arena, the private sector can really play an active role in promoting gender equality and investment, where multinationals can be conducive to creating more employment opportunities for women. UNCTAD has reported this previously, and they have asserted that multinationals have enabled more women in more countries to enter the formal sector through their companies or affiliates, which has resulted in higher standards of living and better social outcomes. However, a rise in investments by multinationals risks increasing gender inequality when, for instance, and we all know this situation, the jobs created for women remain confined to low-paid activities or occur in the informal sector if adequate employment or working conditions are lacking, or when upgrading of skills is insufficient for women to remain employed. So maximizing the benefits for women in terms of investments by multinationals requires action from both the public and the private sectors at the national and at the international levels. And domestically, and I always say this, legal reform and enforcement of gender policies by local governments in the countries where a multinational operates is crucial. So the actions of multinational enterprise do have significant impact on global practices and norms. Investing in women and gender issues can benefit companies as well as the communities where they have operations. But although on paper they might be taking part, multinationals as a whole, for example, ExxonMobil, Unilever, and other big ones, they are taking part in the global movement to address gender issues. Companies must ensure that this participation is ingrained in the company-wide culture, not just at the headquarters or among senior leadership. So multinationals need to ensure to that end that their activities have a positive impact on the host economies where they carry out their operations. So I'll stop here, Colin.
Thank you very much, Amrita.
Thank you. So let me, in these 2 minutes, talk about how we can make trade agreements work, especially now as the pandemic is undoing years and decades of progress made in respect of gender equality. As we have heard comments from Terfa and Phyllis talking about how the lights went off in 2020, and now we need to recover back. And we need to think about MSMEs and small businesses owned by women and empowering women in businesses. So we know that a number of agreements include gender concerns, and a huge number of these agreements talk about empowering women in businesses as well. But then almost no FTA so far contemplates how these commitments could be implemented first, second, financed, and third, enforced. For the implementation of gender commitments, countries in their future trade agreements need to create dedicated procedures and institutions that can put their long list of commitments into action. It has been done in Canada, Israel, and Canada, Chile, for instance. FTAs need to spell out the functions of these institutions, milestones, metrics, objectives that they're expected to achieve, and a timeline to achieve them. And I would say the most important in this regard that has not been seen in almost all trade agreements except the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that has recently been signed, is to provide for funding arrangements to finance gender-related activities if we genuinely intend these commitments to be put into action. As of today, even the most advanced FTAs in this respect do not clarify provisions on how parties might seek funding or might find or mobilize the resources to implement these commitments on cooperation relating to access to education and so on and so forth. And almost no trade agreement has included enforceable gender commitments which are subject to dispute settlement machineries. In the absence of enforceable gender commitments and in the absence of applicable dispute settlement procedures, well, enforcement of gender-related commitments remain a distant reality. This implies that a country's failure to comply with its obligations relating to these has absolutely no direct consequence. So there is a half-open door in FTAs that countries need to push upon further by finding different ways of implementing, financing, and enforcing these gender-related commitments. Parties so far have been, and several countries so far have been a bit reluctant to assume especially binding and enforceable commitments in this sense. And they have their reasons. They have their reasons which are pretty valid. But then I would like to conclude with two questions. And these two questions are the main issues that keep me awake. One, if highly enforceable labor standards can be negotiated in agreements such as USMCA, why are we still not ready for enforceable binding gender commitments, such as equal pay for equal work? And two, if we can have exceptions to protect animals, plants, moral values in almost all existing trade policy instruments or all agreements, why can't we negotiate an exception to reduce gender inequality? And by the way, that's a little teaser to my upcoming article, not just sea turtles, let's protect women too.
We will definitely be looking out for that one, Amrita. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left till the end of the session. What I would like to turn to before we have our discussion, in case we run out of time, is to the audience questions. And the first one actually fits in very well with the ambassador's comment on what is happening at the WTO to empower women, or to provide women with equal economic opportunities in the field of international trade. So maybe if, of course, the ambassador is more than welcome to give his take. If there's anybody else who would like to address this question, please jump in.
So not as much as we would like. let me be clear on that. We have the Buenos Aires Declaration, and we've had a series of seminars talking about various aspects and various issues. And now we have the informal working group, and we're hoping to have further work that comes out of MC12. But this is not at this point leading to anything that necessarily results in the creation of rules, with the exception of, as far as I'm aware, that I can see right now, the exception of Canada's suggestion with respect to services domestic regulation, non-discrimination in licensing for service providers in other jurisdictions based on gender. So it's moving slowly. What I would also say, though, is that there are a number of facets here, and one of them that's really interesting is actually getting the chief economist's office and his team to start looking and analyzing what is going on in the world around gender and starting to measure these things. So the conversation is changing a lot, and the number of countries that are supporting our proposed language in services domestic regulation is growing. So it's moving, but it's moving very slowly. We're still not at a significant measure. We have a significant measurement problem, I would say, that we have not yet addressed. And until we measure, it's going to be difficult for us, and measure properly, it's going to be difficult for us to start thinking about what the rules should look like to address what it is that we're discovering in that measurement. So unfortunately, I would say it's moving much more slowly than it should.
That's true. And I think, maybe we mentioned this before, but a lot of members are hesitant to adopt these so-called discriminatory measures because, basically the pillars of WTO is non-discrimination. And so, some members would say, why do we need gender-specific provisions? Why can't we use them in the exceptions? For example, 20A, public morals, and, So it's quite a contentious topic for many members, and that is why only 118 WTO members have signed to the joint declaration, the Buenos Aires Joint Declaration that the ambassador was talking about. Okay, so I'm going to move on to, thank you very much for that answer. Let me move on to the next question. That talks about the AFCFTA. And I don't know if there's anybody here who can talk to the specific question, but it says the AFCFTA has various provisions in the preamble, for example, in Article 3 as well, in the protocols of trade and services and free movement of persons on the objective of gender equality. And the question goes, to what extent do you think that gender mainstreaming will be implemented through the AFCFTA and better implemented than it is currently in the African regs? Yes, so I think I saw Amrita first, and then of course, Tefa, please jump in after Amrita.
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. I would first try and address the latter part of the question as to whether, to what extent other RTAs have talked about gender equality considerations. And I think there are several very gender responsive agreements in the region. East African Community has a provision which for a change is a binding legal obligation on the parties, whereby the parties commit to ensuring gender balance in legislative assembly. And ever since this agreement came into force, along with this provision, there has been a visible difference in the representation of women in legislative assemblies of the member parties. We have COMESA. COMESA talks about participation in decisions, and it talks about elimination of border discrimination, starting awareness programs to change negative cultural stereotypes against women. So we have these quite ambitious agreements at the moment, but the African continent free trade agreement is certainly unique in three respects. First, it includes the promise of gender equality in its very preamble. And as trade lawyers and trade enthusiasts, we know the importance of front loading these issues in the preamble itself, because it throws light on how the entire agreement can be interpreted. Second, this is one of the only agreements, perhaps, where parties talk about how they might go about mobilizing the funds, the money, to put their gender-related commitments into action. And third, there is a commitment specifically talking about enhancing the export capacity of women-owned SMEs. So connecting to the points that Terfa and Phyllis have made, here is an agreement that talks about and that seeks to enhance the exporting capacity of women-owned SMEs in an explicit manner by trying to reduce the barriers such as access to finance and access to other products and resources they face at the very outset. And the provision again is a hard provision in the sense that it is not framed or drafted in a best endeavor promise. But to me, these are the three unique aspects of the African Free Trade Agreement.
Thank you. Terfa, please.
I think Amrita has really actually spoken to the topic, but I would just say that experience on the continent does show that we do take women issues and women's economic empowerment and making sure that they're involved and part of efforts moving forward. How much that has resulted in, actual progress is still debatable. But within the institutions, that you have specific divisions and departments that are focused on women and women's participation in not just the institution, but with member states. It's the same thing with ECOWAS, it's the same thing with the African Union and their own department on that. There are several protocols and both at the regional and sub-regional levels that support women's rights and women's economic empowerment. And they've been part of the fight for years, to go from about 50 years now. But I think it's still the same challenge, I think, with trade policy. It's one thing to have it in text, it's another thing for it to actually translate into results for women-owned businesses and for women. And I think that's what we're trying to understand now. I know that, and while I have the floor, I just wanted to speak because I remember reading Amrita's paper and being moved by that statement that you made about why protect the turtles, why not protect women as well. And to be honest, I see both sides of the arguments. I see the need for us to move quickly. I see the need for these agreements to have enforceable provisions, but I also am drawn, I feel like if we are learning so much about how these two spaces interact, and I think there's the consciousness that we shouldn't do harm and we shouldn't draw back, the results that have already we've been able to achieve over the last couple of years. So that's where I would say maybe there is merit to actually learn. We're seeing today that some of these agreements, we're just starting to develop impact assessments on the impact of trade to the woman and to the community and to the micro level. So to start to make rules that are enforceable when we don't even understand the impact of those rules, and we might be putting the horse or the cart before the horse. So I do think there's merit, and I do completely understand that, but I think we need to do a lot of learning to make sure that the rules that we're crafting are actually safe and they don't do harm before we lock it down and say this is how we're going forward.
Thank you very much, Terfa. So we have about 2 minutes left, and I'm also going to take my liberties to ask probably the question that's going to close our session, specifically to Phyllis. So, you've explained to us that current trade agreements are not responsive, especially to MSMEs, and small, medium SMEs. So the US is negotiating an FTA with Kenya right now. And there's an opportunity to perhaps get some of the benefits that you were not able to get through AGOA. So if you could whisper into the ears of Kenya's trade negotiator, what type of benefits would you like that agreement to provide for people like you?
Wow, what an interesting question. Number one, please involve me in in creating these agreements, number one, because once you involve me, then I will know what it entails. So it's not something crafted out there and presented to me. I am the process, because I am the beneficiary. So I know what I need Okay, so the next thing would be perhaps to clarify and to ensure that when you say honey is included or leather is included, that in that trade agreement, to clarify, what kind of business quantities then qualify for this kind of, benefit to be realized. Yeah, so I think those are the two that I can think about right now. But information for me has been the key thing. And perhaps the next thing I would say is, what are the big pillars, maybe 3 big pillars that you are working on to make sure this happens so that I can be aware where to go. Tafa talked about business support organizations. Which organizations are you working with? Can you clarify? Can we have access to these papers? Can we have capacity building to explain what this means and how it's applicable to small businesses? And can we have a baseline survey and an end line survey that tells that we moved Phyllis's business from 3 to 6? On a scale of 1 to 10, or whether we moved her from 4 to 10. Can we be able to, and can we have success stories? Because I know there's a lot that has gone in there. There must be success stories, but we don't know what those look like. Can we create success stories together and publicize them? I hope those wouldn't be too many questions.
No, definitely not. I think too few. All right, thank you so much to you panelists. I mean, this session is really, it's exceeded my expectations, it's blown my mind open to all of these issues that still need to be worked on, but also to the progress that we've made so far. And obviously, COVID has really affected women negatively. And I really hope that, this is, going into policymakers' ears, and that there's obviously more inclusion, as Phyllis was saying, of women at the very beginning of the negotiation processes. But also, I think it's also incumbent on women to get organized, right? We need to get organized. So thanks again. It's been a brilliant session, and I hope to see you guys next time. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.